What up, it's Prime Pete. EOMM, or Engagement Optimized Matchmaking, has been taking the modern multiplayer gaming industry by storm. And ever since the mass realization that there was more going on behind the scenes than meets the eye, there's been a surge of backlash and critical feedback pertaining to this design choice being implemented into big-name multiplayer titles, such as Call of Duty, Warzone, Apex Legends, Fortnite, and even FIFA, all in their own unique ways. However, the main culprit of abusing this system way past this point of actually making money is Call of Duty, or more specifically, Activision, the company that owns the franchise. The reason EOMM has been popularized is due to its inherent and observed success that is statistically superior to the past efforts of game devs implementing SBMM, otherwise known as skill-based matchmaking, or CBMM, connection-based matchmaking. How EOMM differs from SBMM is in one essential way. Instead of only ever matching a player with other players within a certain confine of perceived skill level consistently, resulting in matches that are very even across the board for all player demographics, EOMM, as the name Engagement Optimized implies, focuses on matching players into a game that best engages their interest in the game, and renders them the most likely to queue up for another match, get addicted to the game, and then as a result spend more money on the game on microtransactions such as bundles and the battle pass. A lot of players still question the existence of heavy EOMM in Call of Duty, especially in a title like Modern Warfare 3 that seems to have extremely tight skill-based matchmaking instead. There are more than enough testimonies to go around that matches are always extremely competitive the higher in skill you get, which is a trait normally indicative of skill-based matchmaking. After all, according to that algorithm, the higher up in skill you climb, the more difficult and tight your matches will become, because your opponents are still consistently close to you in skill level. But something has been overlooked in this year's Call of Duty title that can prove that EOMM is and has been very present since at least as early as Black Ops 4. The primary thing that modern and extremely sophisticated matchmaking algorithms are designed to do is make sure that players stay engaged playing the game as long as possible, not to make fun or fair matches. How does creating incredibly competitive matches for the most skilled players engage anyone, when it seems the vast majority of die-hard players are becoming increasingly more frustrated with how the matchmaking is functioning? Let's come back to that in a second. We first have to remember that multiplayer games are not only designed to be competitively viable. Popular franchises like Call of Duty and other battle royale games are designed for every demographic. Fortnite is a perfect example. What looks like a bright and fun children's game turns out to have one of the most cutthroat and ridiculous skill ceilings of any game ever. Pair that with the fact that no player has seemed to reach the said skill ceiling yet, and you get a game that maintains its momentum over the 6 years of its release. However, casual play is still very well supported even if the game has a very competitive side. Same thing goes for a game like Valorant. While the game has a colorful anime design and appeal to younger audiences, the game within the higher ranks is extremely competitive and difficult to master. This all being said, Call of Duty isn't only meant for the sweats. It's meant for the 40-year-old dads that want to sit on their couch and play on their flat screen TV after a long day, aka the casuals. As with any video game, we have less insanely good players and less total noobs than just simply the average player. In fact, the game is most highly populated with players in the middle percentages that have anywhere from average to slightly above and below average skill levels. And we can draw this conclusion simply by using the definition of the word average. There wouldn't be an average casual skill level if it wasn't the statistical average. In regards to matchmaking, what the algorithm is essentially doing to the players that are better than average is exactly what EOMM is, but maybe not directly to the players in question. See, EOMM is a system that targets every player of the demographic, which means that it also goes after the average and below average players just as much as it goes after the better players. EOMM is also, as we discussed earlier, an algorithm that will place us into a match with the highest calculated likelihood that we queue up for another match afterwards, depending on that result. Both types of players within a demographic for a game have different reasons they'd quit playing a game, whether for a couple hours or indefinitely. Let's take the two main player types, casuals and competitors. A couple reasons a casual player would quit is because the game is just boring and doesn't have any entertainment value, they're getting destroyed too much by people better than them, or they're not performing well and having no fun because of that, whether or not the game has solid gameplay. Some reasons a more competitive die-hard fan of a game would quit a game that they formerly loved is because either the game lacks entertainment value at its core, which is why a lack of mechanical and technical diversity killed Modern Warfare 2 for competitive players, or the game becomes too boring or too repetitive. They get tired of doing the same thing over and over again and decide to do something new in another game. Both player types have different reasons for quitting a game. However, the reason they don't share the reason of getting beaten all the time is because competitive Call of Duty players care about getting better. So instead of quitting, they sharpen their skill set to avoid more future losses. However, this raises some important questions for the developers. In the implementation of EOMM, they have to make sure it does the most effective job possible at eliminating the reasons players would quit playing the game and keep them engaged the entire time. In the case of casuals, EOMM would would have to make sure that the game stays interesting and has some action every match, but the most important factor is making sure that casual players are shielded away from diehard competitive fans of the franchise that are more highly skilled, so they don't quit the game as a result. This fully explains why the sweatier demographic of the player base are constantly playing in total sweatfest lobbies basically every match they play. The algorithm literally doesn't allow them to be playing against players noticeably worse than them, because in doing so, Activision risks losing their casual fans, which are the majority of the player base. After all, casual players are most of the time indifferent towards whatever game they're playing. They just play video games for fun and for fun exclusively. And rightfully so. If a game isn't fun, they'll just quit. Getting drilled by sweats all the time is not fun, so Modern Warfare 3 set out to keep the sweats as far away from the casuals as possible, especially considering the technical and mechanical diversity of the game, which explains not only why what's left of the casual fanbase is what is keeping the game alive, but why the passionate fans of the franchise are dropping like flies. This essentially locks them all into one matchmaking bracket where everyone is as close to their skill level as humanly possible, and as a result, every single match has no diversity whatsoever, and feels like the same CDL tournament final over and over and over again. Activision aren't doing this because they think it's funny to torture us. More accurately, it's a direct consequence of protecting the casual players. We're shielded and walled off from them, and are chosen to be the demographic that gets sacrificed because we're less prone to quit due to aggravation of hyper-competitive lobbies. This is step 1 of EOMM. Before we cover step 2, let's just talk about why EOMM is inherently an unfair system to begin with. And you might say, well, Pete, you said before that a match is fair regardless of the skill gap because everyone has access to the same things, making it fair, which is very true. But there's one aspect of EOMM that is a huge deal breaker for a lot of players out there, and that is the one element that affects each player within a lobby disproportionately, and that is ping. See, the way EOMM prioritizes its matchmaking is, like we discussed earlier, placing players into a match that is the most likely to keep them engaged and queuing up for another match afterwards. However, this sacrifices the player's connection, which isn't difficult to prove at all. In a better system that matchmakes purely based on ping, each player will be playing with people that have just as strong or a weaker connection as they do, which means everyone will be playing a good match that is just as smooth, or inversely, everyone will be rubber banding just as much as the next guy. However, when a matchmaking algorithm doesn't prioritize ping, and instead is allowed to venture anywhere to find a match that is the most likely to keep the player engaged, it obviously will have to sacrifice a good connection in order to do that. Look at it this way. Instead of having an entire player base to match with, and a huge amount of players with similar internet connectivity, now the algorithm is searching for a specific kind of match to throw the player into, which narrows the range of the player base that this player can be potentially matched with significantly. As a result, the likelihood of matching with players with similar or equal ping diminishes exponentially, which then results in lobbies having drastically different ping values for almost every player, meaning everyone is experiencing the match differently, and since the matches are extremely competitive and tight with two teams of players so close in skill level, whichever player has the best ping will probably take the cake. What I'd consider the second and most diabolical step of EOMM is making sure that players have a match experience that makes them the most likely to queue up again, as I've mentioned before. This is where it gets interesting. I'll let a study conducted by the people who invented EOMM do the talking. You can find this study in the description. Take a look at this graph. We can see here that there's simply two sections, the last 3 match outcomes and the churn rate. The churn rate is defined earlier in the study as the probability that this player gets off the game after the 3rd match. These numbers are actually accurate statistical data derived from a very popular EA PvP game that's unnamed within the study, but I'm pretty sure it's FIFA because there are draws within these results, and in a shooter, that's not a very common occurrence. You'd expect the highest churn rate or probability that a player would quit for a longer time period after 3 consecutive losses, and you'd be correct. Now, what combination of wins, draws, and losses do you think produces the next highest churn rate? You'd probably guess the next lowest degree. Draw, loss, loss, right? Well, that's wrong. Actually, more wrong than you think. It's win, win, loss. What? How does this make sense? Just keep this in mind for later. The next highest churn rate is for draw, loss, 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 win, loss, or loss, draw, loss. There's only one win out of all 3 combinations, and it's preceded and proceeded by a loss. So why is the probability of players getting off the game lower when presented with these stats? This isn't even the craziest part. The lowest churn rate comes from these 3 combinations: draw, loss, win, loss, loss, win, loss, draw, win, and draw, draw, draw. Is it possible to explain why these combinations are extremely important to the framework of EOMM? Well, absolutely. Remember how I've said that inconsistency breeds addiction and keeps players on a game? Well, that's no joke. And there's a significant reason why this data makes sense. Players are most likely to get off the game after 3 losses or 3 bad performances. Makes sense. You're consistently doing poorly. Funny enough, you're also likely to get off after 2 wins and then a loss. This can be frustrating as a player to think you're doing well then to lose. Or you could just be doing very well and then you're satisfied with your performance after 2 games and you plan to get off after the next one anyways. And if you happen to lose, it's just the way it goes. Either way, the next lowest probability also makes sense. There's barely any winning involved, just draws and losses. It makes sense why the player would get off the game. I think the next section is the most shocking out of all of it though. 3 consecutive wins actually breeds a higher probability of getting off the game than any of these 4 combinations, and it proves our hypothesis. Any combination of 3 matches that includes either consistent losses, consistent wins, or a mixture of draws and losses are much more likely to make the player quit playing than if their performance is extremely inconsistent. Draw, loss, win, and loss, draw, win, and even loss, loss, win are all great examples of inconsistent results, and consequently the player is the least likely to quit when experiencing inconsistent results, twice as likely to stay on the game as they are after 3 losses, and 37% more likely to stay on after 3 wins. Inconsistency still does better than consistently performing well. However, notice all 3 of these combinations end with a win, and the combinations that end in a loss are all the most likely to make the player get off the game. However, this problem is pretty unavoidable, as someone has to lose in the case of COD. FIFA, believe it or not, has a draw rate of 20% regardless of skill gaps, unlike COD where draws are extremely rare. This is where COD and FIFA differ, and how we can explain how the algorithm still makes sense even if players are still allowed to lose. In FIFA, a game that features primarily 1v1s, the player's individual performance normally dictates a win, loss, or draw. However, within Call of Duty, it's a team's performance that dictates whether a win or loss occurs, which means that a player could have a great game, but their team could still lose. In my experience as a player, it's more fun and engaging to have a great game and lose than a horrible game and win. And I'm sure most of the player base can agree with me there, and so can the matchmaking. Call of Duty's engaging factor is not very much oriented towards winning or losing, like games based on 1v1s like FIFA, and is more oriented towards how you perform individually apart from your team. We can see that with how tight the scores are in each match. Thanks to this study, we can observe how and why EOMM works. It's statistically proven that inconsistency breeds the extension of a play session, and from that front, we can introduce the most diabolical way that EOMM works, and that is throwing the player into a lobby that is most likely to keep them engaged, by forcing their performance to be as inconsistent as possible. The best part is, since the algorithm is always active, it doesn't have to deal with the solution to other independent variables, like a win or loss that shouldn't have happened. It's in control the entire time. For example, let's take player A. We can see here that player A has lost 2 matches straight and hasn't played too well either. So as a result, it's in the best interest of the algorithm to give them a win, or a good performance in the case of COD, to keep them playing the game. And on the flip side, we have player B. This player has won 2 matches straight and played well in the process. If these 2 players match together, it's most likely going to happen like this. Player A will be placed on the stronger team and will be guaranteed a win and a good performance, and player B will be placed on the weaker team and be guaranteed a loss and a bad performance. In both instances, each player will have the match that makes their experience inconsistent, which is the most likely to engage them both and keep them both playing. And by matching them against each other based on each player's individual algorithmic requirements, and then doing this for all 12 players in the lobby, EOMM can knock out 12 birds with 1 stone. In summary, every player's performance in every match happens as the algorithm intends it to. This is also why your ping can get so awful within a match. The algorithm is trying to create the most effective match to keep 12 players engaged as possible, and to do that, it has to create an extremely specific scenario in which the right thing can happen to each player, which in turn narrows narrows the amount of players that each player can be matched with, and as a result, sacrifices ping. We can even take it a step further. If we look at player B again, if he loses after 2 wins, his likelihood of getting off the game is almost the highest possible. However, what if we can give his team a win, but still make sure he performs poorly? Make the opposing team better than player B, but still not good enough to compete with the rest of player B's team, which will carry him. I'm telling you guys, EOMM is this good, and the team balancing is scarily powerful. This all being said, EOMM doesn't exclusively match players with other players exactly on their proximity in regards to skill level. It mainly relies on keeping performances inconsistent, breeding engagement, but also making sure that the casuals are protected from the diehard players. So, the algorithm can explore matches outside of a player's proximal skill bracket to give players the results that are necessary to perpetuate their play session. Now that we understand that each player demographic is different, and it is necessary to separate the sweats from the casuals, and that it's proven by statistical evidence from popular PvP games that inconsistency keeps players playing, and algorithms designed to give players the exact results they need to keep playing are implemented, we ask the age-old question: does EOMM actually work? And the answer is only if you don't notice it. I mean, it clearly works in games like Fortnite, a battle royale game that is known to use this system, but it's a battle royale game, not 6v6 multiplayer. Fortnite has maintained steadily near 1 million players for a long time. There's a reason why there are thousands of videos about COD's horrible matchmaking algorithms, and not nearly an equal amount of videos or complaints about Fortnite's. Fortnite only has one team or one person end up being the winner. It's preposterous to argue the point that EOMM rigged your matches when your projected probability of winning is just between 1 and 4%. Additionally, it's just generally unnoticeable, especially with the inclusion of AI bots, and if you have decent skills within the game and are smart enough, you'll usually last the top 10 every match if you make smart decisions. Because of the smart implication of EOMM into Fortnite, it's had incredible player retention for over 6 years. But COD just can't retain its players right now. We can't even get numbers on any other platform but Steam, because they don't want to reveal them. Otherwise, they'll probably lose a lot of investors and go bankrupt. Modern Warfare 3 is easily the best COD game in the last 5 years, with old nostalgic maps, good movement, good gunplay, excellent mechanics, a good perk system, and fun gameplay. So why are the numbers this bad when the game is objectively pretty good? Well, for starters, the EOMM is extremely noticeable. The inconsistency across every match is more than enough to indicate its existence, and when people notice it, their general reaction is going to be one of extreme outrage and frustration. The answer is as social as it is game-related. For starters, passionate players are more likely to take to the internet to vent their frustrations about the game. And as I mentioned earlier, most matches played by better than average players are extremely competitive, which is a very boring, tiring, and repetitive situation to be in. And as I've said, boring gameplay will drive competitive players away from the game, and probably not just peacefully. They'll most certainly be aggravated with the state of the game and try to spread that aggravation and see if other players are experiencing it. I'm a perfect example. I took to YouTube to expose the game for what it is, a manipulative experience that could actually be fun if they just quit it with the abysmal matchmaking practices. There's been a huge wave of awareness being spread about EOMM and Activision's scummy business practices, which has driven a lot, and I mean a lot, of passionate players away from the game. This accounts for a lot of the missing players, but not a majority. What happened to a lot of the casual player base? Well, we can't forget that a lot of casual players watch YouTubers like Blame Truth, Nero Cinema, among an other plethora of creators that expose these scummy practices as well, and talk about a lot of the blatant issues that are going on within the game. Exclusive Ace literally proved that the better you do, the worse your connection gets. This can undoubtedly turn even casuals off from the game, because any coherent argument about EOMM and other shady practices is enough to scare people away from it. So popular, passionate players can also influence the casuals as well, which comes as a surprise to nobody. We've already discussed how ping makes lobbies unfair. Once players are aware of this, it may scare away even more of them. As for the remaining players that left, there's no telling what's making them leave. We can obviously speculate, but there's no way to truly know. We could guess that it's the $70 price point of the game, or it's too sweaty for some average players, which can make sense if they're near the better demographic of average players. Whatever it is, Call of Duty's numbers are awful, at least on Steam. But I invite you to think with me here. Call of Duty have come out and said some pretty bold things, mainly about their player counts. However, they've never once shown live player counts on Blizzard, Xbox, or PlayStation. If the numbers were brag-worthy, they'd already be shown, and there's no disputing that. As a final point, if EOMM was so good for us as players and was so fun and successful, why do the devs have a non-disclosure agreement about it? It's because they want to hide its existence from us, and it's because it's not working how they intended it to, and it's because it's a shady, manipulative system that makes our entire experience playing the game tailored and fake. So I'll ask again, does EOMM work? Well, only if you're unaware of it. And a system that only works if you're unaware of it doesn't sound like it's too friendly, does it? You know what else only works if you're unaware of it? Brainwashing. As a result of being aggravated by EOMM, I took to the internet to spread the truth. I've noticed more and more players hopping on board with this movement, and I hope we can bring change to Call of Duty. And maybe Microsoft can actually step in for us. But that's all I got for now. If you learned something or have something I missed, let me know in the comments. Take it easy.